Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Last night my mom told me I would never be as pretty or as successful as my sister. She said it right there at Sunday dinner, with my dad pretending to be busy with the mashed potatoes and my sister smiling like she was embarrassed, but also a little satisfied, as if this was a compliment wrapped in cruelty. I did not fight back, I did not cry, I did not slam my fork down or storm off the table. I just stood up, started stacking the plates, and carried them to the sink like nothing happened, even though inside I felt that familiar sting that has been there since childhood, the one that never really goes away because it has been planted so deep. I told myself that this time I would not argue or beg or try to prove myself, because none of that has ever mattered. Instead, I would do something different, something that would not be erased with a shrug or dismissed with, "Oh, you're too sensitive." I spent that evening not replaying the insult over and over, but pulling out my laptop, logging into my accounts, and freezing my credit across all 3 bureaus. I had learned long ago, through my work in compliance, that silence can be louder than any argument when it is backed by a paper trail. It took maybe 15 minutes to lock everything, but the sense of control it gave me felt like the first real breath after being underwater too long. Then I ordered my full credit reports. I knew it would take a few days for them to arrive, but I had a feeling something was waiting there, something that had been brushed aside because I had trusted people who kept telling me not to dig into the past. While I waited for confirmations from the bureaus, I started combing through my old folders where I keep everything, tax returns, pay stubs, even those letters most people throw away after a year. People have laughed at me for keeping so many records, but in that moment it felt less like over-preparing and more like carrying an umbrella when the storm finally arrives. I found a notice from about 2 years ago, something I had ignored at the time because I assumed it was a mistake, an alert that my credit had been checked for a small business line tied to Marissa's salon. I never followed up on it back then because when I casually mentioned it, Mom had snapped, "Oh, you're always making drama where there is none," and Marissa had said she had no idea what I was talking about. I had believed them, or maybe I just wanted the peace more than the truth. This time I took no one's word for anything. I scanned the document, emailed it to myself with the subject line "evidence," and marked the time. I wanted no argument later about when I had found it or what it meant. I wasn't sure exactly how far this would go, but I knew I had to be ready. That night I didn't sleep much, not because I was upset, but because I was strangely calm. Every insult before had sent me spiraling, thinking of all the things I should have said but didn't. This time I felt steady, like I had finally learned the right language, not yelling, not defending, but paperwork and dates and signatures that couldn't be argued with. By early morning my phone buzzed with a voicemail from the bank. The woman on the line said she needed to discuss a joint obligation in my name. She sounded polite but firm, the kind of voice that tells you this is not a courtesy call. I listened to it twice, then 3 times before saving it. My hands were steady, no shaking, no panic. I made myself coffee, opened my email, and started drafting a list of questions I would ask the bank when I called them back. Things like, what date was the application? Who is present? Which signatures are on file? Do they have copies of IDs? Do they have an IP address for the online portion? And while I typed, a part of me almost laughed, not because this was funny, but because I realized that Mom had spent years telling me I would never be as successful as my sister, and here I was, finally using the one skill I had always been told was too much: my attention to detail, my stubbornness with records, my refusal to let things slide, to turn the whole story around. I didn't know exactly where this was going yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done arguing at the dinner table. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get it, but it would be fought with documents, not insults. And when the truth came out, it would not be me who looked sensitive or bitter. It would be them trying to explain why my name appeared on obligations I never agreed to. By noon that same day, before I even had the chance to return the bank's call, my phone lit up with a text from Marissa. It said, "Call me. Mom's in tears and won't say why." And I sat there staring at the screen, knowing for the first time in years that the tears at the table were not mine. I stared at Marissa's text long enough to feel the old reflex push up in my chest, the one that says drop everything, rescue the family mood, make the crying stop so everyone can go back to pretending nothing ever happened. And then I set the phone face down on the table and dialed the bank instead, because if I have learned anything from years of being told to calm down, it is that you can waste your whole life tending to other people's feelings while your name, your credit, and your future are used like a coat hook by the door, something convenient to lean on and forget about when it is not needed. The fraud department picked up faster than I expected. The representative introduced herself in that careful voice people use when they know you might cry or yell, and I surprised both of us by speaking clearly, giving my full name and the reference number from the voicemail, confirming my freeze, and asking for the dates, amounts, and authorization trail for whatever they believed I had. Agreed to, because if they were going to say the words joint obligation, then we were going to talk about signatures, IDs, IP addresses, branches, notarization stamps, and any other artifact that could not be waved away with the line that I must have forgotten or said yes without thinking. She went quiet for a beat in that way that tells you she is looking at something she did not expect. Then she said there was a small business line that had been opened a little over 2 years ago, that my name appeared as a cosigner, that the contact email was not mine, and that several late fee reversals and courtesy credits over the past year had been processed without a single phone verification to me, which I flagged as a problem not because I enjoy being difficult, but because if you put my name on a thing, then you do not get to treat me like a silent partner who only exists when the bill is due. I told her I was filing a formal dispute and wanted the original application with wet signatures or, if it was partially online, the KYC package, including the uploading device details and the branch where any in-person portion occurred. Along with the list of users who had access to the account since inception, I asked her to note in the record that I had placed a comprehensive freeze and that any further activity should be treated as suspect until the dispute was resolved, and I said I would follow up with a written letter sent certified because phone calls vanish into thin air while paper tends to stay put and make people behave. She did not argue, which made me think she had seen this movie before, and when she offered to email a dispute template I said yes, and then, because I am done apologizing for asking adults to do adult things, I asked her to place a caution on an associated vendor processing feed that I could see now in the online portal, a feed clearly tied to the salon's launch orders, and she said the freeze already forced a review flag and that some payouts might slow until the identity issue was cleared, and I nodded even though she could not see me, because justice rarely makes noise at first. It just removes grease from wheels and lets friction do its quiet work. When I hung up, I finally called Marissa, who started talking so fast I could barely follow, telling me the color supplier had emailed about a verification hold and the boutique landlord had asked for updated proof of financing. That mom had been on the phone all morning trying to fix something but would not explain what exactly needed fixing, that I should not be mad, and that everything was just a misunderstanding, which is the family word for anything that casts me as an obstacle, not a person, and I told her to breathe and to listen because I was not screaming or accusing. I was asking for documents and offering a clean path forward, which is more than I ever got when the shoe was on my foot and they wanted me to move along for the sake of peace. She asked if I would please talk to Mom because she was crying, and I said I would, but after I had my paperwork and after I spoke to someone who did not share my last name, because this time the story was not going to be told in our kitchen where history gets rewritten between the sink and the fridge. While I waited for the bank's email, an old memory clicked into place like a key. Grandma Ruth sitting with me the year before she passed, telling me in that practical way of hers that equal means equal, and that money has a way of turning siblings into strangers if you let people get away with little shortcuts, and I remembered the letter she said she mailed. The one Mom later claimed was misdirected, and for the first time I felt sure the letter existed somewhere other than Grandma's intention. I called Aunt Denise, who does not traffic in family myths, and told her what was happening, and there was not even a second of shocked silence, just a soft, "I was wondering when you would find it," followed by a name I did not know I needed until I heard it. An attorney she said Grandma had used for estate letters and consumer issues, a man who did not bluster or gossip, who simply wrote things down in ways that made people stop trying to dance around them. She said she would text me his number and that she also had access to a scan of something Grandma had sent out because she demanded copies for her own files, and if I wanted it, she would forward it later today. I opened my email to see the bank's dispute template already sitting there, and I filled it out with the kind of care you reserve for signing a lease or dissolving one, laying out the dates I knew and the questions I needed answered. Attaching the old business credit inquiry notice I had found in my folder, and copying myself at another email address so I could prove the timeline if anyone tried to accuse me of making this up after the fact. Then I printed it, signed with an unforgiving stroke, and prepared the certified envelope because if I have learned anything in compliance, it is that the green receipt at the counter buys you a slice of truth when everyone else wants to buy time. Mom called while I was sealing the envelope and I sent it to voicemail, not to be cruel, but to keep the order of operations intact, because feelings would happily consume the whole day while the facts sat in a pile getting colder, and I was done feeding the beast. By late afternoon, I had a consultation on the books with the attorney Aunt Denise recommended. I had a text from her saying she found the scan and would send it the moment she was home, and I had a second voicemail from the bank, this time from a supervisor, saying they had located the original application with signatures and accompanying ID images, and would be emailing a secured link within the hour, which meant that for the first time in a long time I was not guessing or defending or pleading. I was waiting for the one thing our family never seems to invite to the table, the kind of proof that does not care who cries, because it just sits there and forces you to read it. When the secured link from the bank finally opened on my laptop, I felt a strange mix of dread and validation, because even though I had suspected something like this for years, seeing a document with my name printed neatly across the top and a signature that looked enough like mine to fool someone, but not enough to be real was a different kind of wound. One that was less about being betrayed and more about realizing that the people closest to me had counted on me staying quiet forever, hoping I would never bother to ask for proof or follow the trail of paperwork they left behind. The form itself was messy, with my name attached as a cosigner, but the signature was jagged in places I never write jagged, the loops tight where mine are always open. And there were identification numbers attached that matched my social security, but none of the usual verification steps that banks are required to perform, which told me that someone, whether through charm, influence, or negligence, had allowed this to slip through with little more than a wink and a nod, and I knew immediately who that someone had to be. I printed the file, set it on the table beside Grandma Ruth's scan letter that Aunt Denise had just forwarded, and for the first time in years I felt like I was not crazy. Like the vague unease I had been carrying was not paranoia, but evidence waiting to be organized. The letter from Grandma was dated, notarized, and painfully clear. She wanted her estate divided equally between Marissa and me, but with one condition, that any debt incurred in one daughter's name had to be settled before the division. Because she had seen families crumble over money, and she believed fairness had to be measured not just in what was given, but in what was taken away. Reading that line, I felt a lump in my throat that was not sadness, but a sort of vindication, because here it was in black and white, the one voice in the family who had always treated me like more than a shadow, speaking from beyond the grave with more clarity than Mom had ever allowed in her living room. When I met with Mr. Alvarez, the attorney Aunt Denise had recommended, I brought every document I had, stacked neatly in a folder that I refused to call overprepared, because in that office it was not overprepared, it was survival. He was calm in a way that made me trust him immediately, the kind of calm that comes from years of hearing messy stories and knowing the difference between drama and facts, and after reading through the letter and the bank forms he leaned back and said, "This is not unusual, but it is absolutely actionable." He explained that the inheritance letter, while not a will in itself, was a legal instruction attached to the estate documents, and because it had been mailed certified to my parents' house with proof of delivery, it could not be dismissed as a suggestion. It was enforceable. He also said that the fraudulent use of my information on the loan application was a separate matter, one that could involve both civil and potentially criminal consequences if pursued, though in his experience families often preferred to negotiate settlements quietly rather than see each other in court. I told him I did not want a courtroom spectacle, not because I was afraid, but because I knew how easily Mom would twist that into a story about me humiliating the family, and I did not need more cousins whispering about how I had taken things too far. What I wanted, I explained, was security, clarity, and a resolution that did not leave me constantly waiting for the next shoe to drop. He nodded, then drafted 2 letters on the spot, one to the bank demanding all application records, security footage if available, and details on the employee who processed the loan, and another to my parents and Marissa, laying out the existence of Grandma Ruth's instructions and the requirement for equal division subject to repayment of any debts improperly tied to my name. He advised me to let him handle all communication from this point forward, because when people feel the weight of legal stationery, their stories tend to shift quickly, and what they were willing to deny in a phone call they often admit to on paper. By the time I left his office, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because the problem was solved, but because the narrative was no longer controlled by sighs, glares, or guilt trips delivered over roast chicken. It was moving into a space where timelines mattered, where signatures were analyzed, and where you misunderstood was no longer an argument, but a stall tactic with an expiration date. When I got home, Dad had left me a voicemail asking if we could please talk this out as a family, and I almost laughed, because if talking it out as a family worked, I would not be standing here with a file folder of evidence and an attorney ready to send certified letters. That night, just as I was preparing to go to bed, an email arrived from the bank in response to Mr. Alvarez's request. It contained a scanned PDF of the loan application, and right there, in the signature box, was a version of my name that looked like mine if you squinted, but that I knew instantly was not my hand. They had even copied the middle initial I rarely use, probably from some document Mom had in her files, and attached a driver's license scan that had clearly been altered. The picture was real, from an old ID. But the address was wrong and the expiration date did not match the one in my possession. I sat staring at the screen, the evidence glowing back at me, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I did not feel anger or fear, but a deep, almost clinical certainty that the game had changed forever. This was no longer about insults at a dinner table or a mother who preferred one daughter over the other. This was about fraud, inheritance, and the deliberate misuse of my identity, all of it now documented in ways that no amount of crying could erase. And as I shut my laptop, I realized that the next time we sat down in a room together, it would not be at our family's dining table, but at a polished oak conference table in Mr. Alvarez's office, where excuses had less air to breathe and where every word would be measured against the ink on the page. Walking into Mr. Alvarez's office for the family meeting felt nothing like the Sunday dinners that had defined our lives for so long, because there were no casseroles to soften the tension, no clinking silverware to mask the silence, and no opportunity for Mom to steer the conversation back to weather or church gossip once it became uncomfortable, since here every word was recorded in a file, every signature weighed against the law, and every attempt at dismissal met with the calm but unflinching gaze of a man who had no interest in family myths, only in what could be proven. Marissa sat on one side of the table looking both defensive and desperate because her salon launch was already tangled in payment holds and supplier delays, while Mom sat beside her with the look of someone determined to perform outrage but terrified of being asked to produce receipts, and Dad hovered at the end of the table as if proximity might count as support, even though his silence had always been the safest place for him to live. Mr. Alvarez began by laying out the inheritance instructions from Grandma Ruth, sliding the notarized letter across the table with a steady hand, and explaining in measured words that equal means equal was not a suggestion but a directive, one that required debts attached to my name to be addressed before any division of assets, which meant the fraudulent loan application and the business line of credit were not minor misunderstandings, but legal obstacles standing between the family and the estate's distribution. Mom tried to interrupt, launching into a speech about how families should handle family matters privately, without strangers inserting themselves into issues that could be solved with kindness and understanding. But Mr. Alvarez did not even raise his voice when he stopped her. He simply explained that once fraud was documented, it ceased to be a family matter and became a legal one, and that the only way to keep it out of court was to agree to terms that acknowledged reality, rather than emotion. For the first time in my life, I watched Mom's insistence collapse under the weight of someone she could not bully or guilt, because every time she tried to twist the story into one of my oversensitivity, Mr. Alvarez calmly brought it back to the documents, the certified delivery receipts, and the mismatched signatures, until the performance lost its power and the silence that followed was heavy enough to make even Marissa look at her with unease. That was when I spoke. Not with anger or tears, but with the steadiness I had been saving for this moment, and I said that I was not asking for apologies, nor was I demanding courtroom drama. I simply wanted fairness, security, and repayment for what had been tied to my name without my consent. I laid out an offer that I had been crafting carefully in my head. Marissa would continue her business, but the debts associated with my identity would be repaid in full into a fund named after Grandma Ruth, a scholarship managed by the local community foundation, so that the money could serve as both restitution and legacy, and in return I would not pursue further legal action provided my name was immediately removed from all accounts and no future obligations were ever opened under it. The room went still, and for a moment I wondered if the silence would break into the usual explosion of accusations, but instead Marissa exhaled sharply, like she had been holding her breath for months, and admitted that she had known something was wrong but had let herself believe it was easier to let Mom handle things than to question where the money and approvals were really coming from. She said the suppliers were already threatening to cancel shipments, the landlord was asking uncomfortable questions, and if I truly wanted repayment through a scholarship fund rather than dragging her to court, she could live with that even if it meant cutting her income for years. But then she leaned closer to me and whispered something that changed the air in the room completely, that this loan was not the first time Mom had used my information, that years ago during a medical emergency when Marissa was still uninsured, Mom had put one of my social security numbers down for hospital paperwork to qualify for a program, and that if I pulled my records from that year I would see charges that were not mine. Hearing that was like having the floor shift beneath me, because suddenly this was not just about a fraudulent business loan or an inheritance letter, it was about a pattern, a willingness to treat my identity as a tool whenever it was convenient, to gamble that I would never notice, or if I did, that I would be too afraid of breaking the family apart to push back. I looked at Mom then, and for the first time she did not glare or lecture, but lowered her eyes, as if the performance had finally cracked. Mr. Alvarez broke the tension by outlining how repayment would work in practice: monthly transfers directly into the scholarship account, a lien on Marissa's business ownership until the debt was cleared, and a binding agreement that barred any future financial use of my name without explicit consent under penalty of immediate legal action. He explained that this offer was generous compared to what a court might demand, and that taking it was the only way to protect reputations while still honoring Grandma Ruth's words. I felt the heat of years of swallowed anger in my chest, but I also felt something sharper and cleaner than anger: control. For once, I was not reacting to their choices, I was setting the terms, and those terms were written, witnessed, and enforceable. The family that had always told me I was too dramatic, too sensitive, too bitter, was suddenly confronted with the fact that my supposed overreactions had become a structure strong enough to hold them accountable, and the irony was almost too much to ignore. As the meeting drew to a close, Marissa signed the preliminary papers with shaking hands. Dad added his name as witness without looking at anyone, and Mom sat stiff and silent, the image of a matriarch unraveling under fluorescent light, while Mr. Alvarez collected the documents with the kind of efficiency that makes you realize the show was over and only the consequences remained. But even as I left the office with copies in my bag and the first real sense of safety I had felt in years, Marissa's whispered confession about the hospital records stayed with me, because if what she said was true, then the fraud had roots deeper than I had imagined, and the repayment plan we had just agreed on was only the beginning of a story that would not be contained by one neat settlement. And as I closed the office door behind me, The thought that echoed in my head was not relief, but anticipation, because the next file I opened might tell me just how far my identity had been stretched before anyone bothered to ask if I noticed. The morning after Marissa's whisper felt like the moment you stop hoping a problem will fade on its own and start treating it like a project with steps, deadlines, and proof. So I sat down with a cup of coffee I barely tasted and filed the identity theft affidavit through the federal portal, then placed calls to the hospital billing office from the year she mentioned, and while I waited on hold listening to a loop that made time feel slow, I pulled my old insurance explanations of benefits, laid them out in order, and circled every entry that did not match the providers I remembered visiting, because if someone had used my number to unlock a program or discount, then that paper would show it even if nobody planned to look closely. And by the time a billing supervisor came on the line, I was ready with dates, claim numbers, and a clear request for a full audit tied to my social security number for that period, with a note that my attorney would follow up with a written request to preserve records in case this ended up attached to a broader settlement. They did not argue, and that alone told me more than any apology would have, because the supervisor's voice had that careful tone people use when they know an error exists somewhere, and their job is no longer to deflect, but to make the next steps frictionless. And within a few hours an email arrived confirming that one admission and one outpatient visit from that year had used my number, while listing contact details that were not mine and a home address that belonged to my parents, which meant this was not a glitch or a typo but a choice, and while my stomach tightened at the thought of my identity being scavenged for convenience, I also felt a steady kind of relief. Because the question was no longer whether I was overreacting, but how fast we could put everything back where it belonged. Mr. Alvarez drafted an addendum that afternoon, a clean set of terms that folded the medical misuse into the financial agreement without giving anyone room to play dumb later. And when he emailed the draft, I read it twice and felt a satisfaction I could not remember feeling in that family, a sense that the rules finally had my name on them in a way that could not be laughed off at a holiday table. The document required removal of my name from any business credit or vendor profile connected to the salon, repayment of the disputed amount into a named scholarship fund administered by the Community Foundation with quarterly statements sent to me and to Aunt Denise as second reader. A written admission of misuse for both the loan and the medical entries kept confidential except in the event of a breach, and, because leverage matters, a temporary ownership lien in the salon equal to the disputed sum that would dissolve automatically when the foundation balance reached the repayment total, with a clause that any late month added a small penalty that converted to additional scholarship money rather than interest in my pocket, because I wanted the outcome to feel like repair, not revenge for its own sake. The meeting to sign was quiet in a way none of our family gatherings had ever been, because there were no speeches, only papers slid forward and pens uncapped, with Mr. Alvarez walking through each clause not to shame anyone but to ensure nothing could be misunderstood later, and when the page with the admission statement reached Mom, she stared at it for a long time as if it might change if she waited, then lifted her eyes and asked whether this meant we were finished punishing each other, and I told her calmly that this was not punishment, it was us choosing clarity over the endless cycle of denial followed by tears followed by more denial, and if she wanted to call that punishment, that was her choice. But I was done living in a house where the loudest story won, so now the paper was the story and the paper did not raise its voice. Dad signed as witness with a hand that trembled a little, but he met my eyes and did not look away, and for him that was a kind of apology I could accept. While Marissa signed every page without arguing, because the lien made the stakes simple and the scholarship kept the money from feeling like a payment to me. And after the last signature, Mr. Alvarez collected the documents and handed me a folder with copies that felt heavier than it should have, not because of the paper, but because of what it meant. That after years of being told I was too sensitive, I had finally built a structure where sensitivity had nothing to do with it, where the outcome depended on actions, not on who could cry first or loudest. We stood to leave and Mom asked if I would ever forgive her, which landed somewhere between a plea and a challenge, and I told her that I was not in the business of declaring verdicts on feelings. That forgiveness for me would be a byproduct of consistent behavior over time rather than a speech on a Tuesday, and that if she truly wanted a future, then she could start by honoring the schedule, sending each transfer on the agreed date, telling the truth when people asked gentle questions instead of inventing new fables, and showing up at the community foundation when the scholarship launched so she could see the applications from people who would benefit from the money that should never have passed through my name in the first place. I said that if she could do those things without dramatics, then the distance between us might shrink on its own without either of us forcing it. In the weeks that followed, I opened an account for the scholarship with the foundation officer who walked me through the process like it was ordinary business, which it was. And when we settled on a simple set of criteria that rewarded steady effort rather than perfect grades or glossy recommendations, I felt something inside me unclench. Because it meant that my grandmother's idea was not just words on paper, but a living thing that would help people who worked hard without a cheering section. People who might have a family like mine and need a hand that did not come with strings. The first transfer hit the fund on time and the lien paperwork posted to the state's business portal, which made the salon's ownership snapshot look different in a way only a few people would notice. And with each small confirmation that the system was doing what it said it would do, I felt the old weight of defending myself lift as if it had never fit me. And when Marissa texted updates about cutting expenses and negotiating with suppliers, I answered without sarcasm, not because I had forgotten everything, but because I had already accounted for it in the terms, and that is a calmer place to live than any apology could ever deliver. A month later, the foundation sent me the first set of guidelines to review before we announced the scholarship's name, and I asked them to keep it simple and to include the line equal means equal in the description. A quiet nod to the only person in the family who cared more about fairness than appearances, and when I signed that form I realized that my victory did not need a trophy or a mic, it needed follow-through, and I had built a plan that delivered exactly that. So when Mom called again to ask whether this meant we were okay, I told her that it meant we were honest and that sometimes honesty is the best we can do, and for now that was enough for me, because the point was never to watch her suffer. The point was to make sure I would not have to live like this again, and that part, with every signature and every transfer and every quarterly statement, was already done.